Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. If everybody can take their seats, we're going to get started again for the afternoon session. Oh, that's a good way to do it. All right, we're going to get started for the afternoon session. Yeah. So, you know, some of the issues that we've been talking about today have been on a number of different panels, and actually I think the issue that we're going to talk about on this panel has kind of come out throughout the conference. And in this panel, we really want to talk about data, issues around data ownership, data about open data, data privacy, who owns this data. There are a lot of issues surrounding this, and so we have some of the key people to talk to us about that today. I'm going to start by introducing our moderator for this session today. Kenneth Cruz joined Columbia University in January 2008 as a founding director of the Copyright Advocacy Office. And for more than 20 years, Dr. Cruz has focused much of his research, policymaking, and teaching on copyright issues. He's published widely on the topic, and he is a frequent speaker at universities and meetings throughout the world. And really, one of the reasons that I'll let Kenneth expand on his bio because I just want to talk about it briefly, but one of the reasons that we asked him to speak today is really, he knows a lot of the kind of issues, intricacies around ownership of data. He'll probably provide us with some of my favorite stories. There's not a lot of case law that deals with data specifically, and that's an issue as cities try to open up their data. And so with that, I'm going to let him come up and talk, and we'll have a great session.
Very good. Thank you. Oh, no. Okay. Are we doing all right? We're all in the dark here, but I thank you so much, but it's ironic that we're in the dark because one of the things that we're busy keeping a secret from everybody is that it's a gorgeous sunny day outside. And so you didn't hear that here. So really, I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been a very exciting opportunity for me to come to a conference and to learn from you, because I obviously come at it from a legal perspective, looking at some of the legal issues. And I really don't want to take away from the time from the speakers, but what I promised I guess I would say what you want me to say is just some of the things that as a copyright person, which is me, I can look at the slides, I can look at the presentations, and I just see copyright dripping off of everything. Because one of the problems is the way that the law of copyright is structured. And we'll talk about more than copyright. We'll get into privacy, we'll get into data protection and so on. But the way copyright law is structured is that if a work is original and fixed in a medium, saved in your computer, for example, like all the PowerPoint slides, that work is instantly, automatically protected by copyright. So therefore, almost everything that's up here on the screen has copyright protection associated with it. So what's remarkable is when we find something that is not protected. And indeed, 20 or so years ago, the US Supreme Court ruled that the standard white pages telephone book, names, addresses, phone number in alphabetical order. I do find myself needing to describe that because nobody uses phone books anymore. That the standard white pages telephone book is not sufficiently creative to be eligible for copyright protection. And when the court ruled that 20 years ago, that was a stunning development of actually ruling that something was outside the reach of copyright. Now, if you're in the data collection business and you see a ruling like that, you've just spent millions of dollars compiling that phone book. that when you see a ruling like that, you know, what's the first thing you do? You get your high-paid lawyer lobbyists and you go to Washington, D.C. and you try to get new law. And that's exactly what was attempted, but it didn't succeed, which takes me to data protection. So data protection law in the United States is thin to almost non-existent. But that's the US. European Union has data protection law. So something that may be protectable there is not protectable here. So in addition to differences in types of laws, we also have differences in jurisdictional issues as well. So I want to quickly get this to our speakers so we hear from them. And I'll be introducing them then one at a time. And so our first speaker I'd like to invite up is Matthew Doss. Now, Matthew Doss is a practicing attorney here in the greater New York City area with a firm that has a broad range of legal services, but he certainly specializes in ground transportation and related businesses, most notably in his experience in his very, very illustrious career. He has been a commissioner and chairman of the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission, and I can only begin to imagine what that entails. He's been appointed recently as a commissioner of the New York City Civil Service Commission and serves as a distinguished lecturer at the City University of New York in their Transportation Research Center. So he brings to us a tremendous amount of experience and knowledgeable background about law and transportation. And so, Matt, I invite you up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for that fantastic introduction. It's certainly an honor to receive such kind words from an expert as yourself. And I have a little bit of an antidote. I never ever envisioned I'd end up at TLC. In fact, when I was in law school, started out looking to become a copyright attorney like you. Got a little discouraged. It's a hard field to break into. And when I was on that path, when I was at NYU Law, before I switched over to employment law and then joined government and everything went in a different direction, I wrote articles and published articles, which you probably get a kick out of, The Adverse Possession of Copyright, which I'd be happy to share with you, Subliminal Messages in Music and First Amendment Rights. Does someone have a First Amendment right to subliminal? This is, you know, you can imagine I must have been drinking a lot when I was in law school. And, you know, the last one I think was using experts in copyright infringement cases for popular music, when you're supposed to kind of have a jury listen to whether the songs sound the same, but they have professors come in with charts and they try to confuse people. So anyway, I ended up going to the government. I've been there for 16 years. I just left about a year or so ago. And, you know, Ken touched a little bit about what I do, and there's just probably too much to go into. I want to thank Columbia University and Professor David King, my colleague and friend, and we've just authored a paper that's going to the TRB in January, as well as Georgia and Sarah for doing a great job and putting this together. I'm happy to be here. I was asked to talk a little bit about not just the use of data in the taxi industry, which is a new development, but a very intriguing one, but also to talk a little bit about some of the legal experience that I've had in implementing this program and the privacy issues that are associated with it. I've been there for a while. I work for both Mayors Giuliani and Bloomberg. I just came from a meeting with the governor's office, so I'm somehow still involved in things. There's a lot of reform and efforts going on. So I basically was general counsel there for a number of years, so I helped draft the rules and regs. I was general counsel at a couple of different agencies, and when I was the youngest and the longest serving commissioner, and now I'm actually, thankfully, imparting some of my experience around the world. I'm the president of what's known as the ITR. The ITR is the International Association of Transportation Regulators. So what we do is we are a not-for-profit educational group of taxi commissioners from all over the world. So we share best practices. Now we're actually getting involved in some lobbying and some other endeavors. But we've embarked on a very aggressive research agenda, and we actually are getting more involved with academics since I've been at what we call the UTRC. Columbia is a consortium member of the University Transportation Research Center. And a lot of people don't know, especially if you're not in the transportation field, what this is. The U.S. DOT, is in the various transportation authorization bills over the years, pumps money into selected universities in certain regions to help facilitate regional research and even collective national research on anything involving transportation for the U.S. The federal government, state and local governments. You know, so I'm the first taxi expert ever to join a TRC. We're in Region 2, New York, New Jersey. I'm housed at City College. And what's been missing in the taxi research area is taxi research. There is none. It's very limited, very sparse. So our mission as part of the Taxi Research Network, and Professor King and I and a variety of other people are just established a working group at the Transportation Research Board for taxi studies, which never existed. So we're very excited about this development. And quite frankly, data has a lot to do with it because it really helps us cross the gap from a traditionally privately regulated industry, which got no attention, to now data that they can use, as well as the paratransit industry, which also has a lot of crossover because there are subsidies. So anyway, Ken talked about my transportation practice. I'm a partner at Windels Marks. We do everything at the firm practically, and including intellectual property. But we basically are a unique practice. There's no such thing as transportation law. We basically invented it. What we do is we provide corporate and regulatory and consulting services for anything on four wheels. If things go well, maybe we'll be dealing with anything that moves. That's the game plan. Now, in terms of the academic stuff and my government experience, I'm going to talk a little bit about a very, very interesting service that we put into place, which was, you know, anything in the taxi industry is difficult to accomplish. And if you read the paper the last, couple of months, you'll see there's so many stakeholders. Even in one industry, there are stakeholders among drivers. There are stakeholders among medallion owners. It's very diverse. It's also very complicated and complex. And they don't necessarily, until the last 10 years or so, like or have been accustomed to change. People dig in with their economic interests. And going back to 2004, Mayor Bloomberg and I announced we were doing a fare increase. And whenever you do a fare increase in a city, you always need to politically give something to the passengers. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people lose sight of the fact that taxi service and limousines and liveries, whatever you want to call the other modes, they all need to be focused on the passenger. And they're missing. There's no such thing as a strap hangers group for taxi passengers, right? We did something which it worked out well. We put a model together and a unique procurement and project which is now being replicated all over the world. And we're very proud of that. And I'm hoping that if some of you have been in a cab recently, I think they come up to Columbia, but if you notice, there are screens in there, and there are credit cards that you can swipe now. And behind the scenes, what you probably don't really know is that there's a ton of data being collected. So we called it TPEP, the Taxi Cab Passenger Enhancement Program. If you work for government as long as I did, you will notice that everything needs to have an acronym, otherwise it doesn't work. There are four components to it. Number one, we have GPS. And there were various bits and pieces of different aspects of what we did, but all over the place. This is the first integrated system that we asked the industry to come up with. So we have GPS, we have passenger information monitors, or PIMs. Those are the screens that you have in the back of the cabs. You have DIMs, the driver information monitors. Those are the little dispatch screens that have information in the front seat where the driver is. And we also have the credit card swipes, and we also, I think in most of the cabs now, have radio frequency IDs devices that you can just tap your card. You don't even have to swipe it. So how does it work? I mean, what we did was very unique. We leveraged, and remember, these are privately owned vehicles, and the government doesn't own them. Some people don't even know that. We don't employ the drivers. We just license them. So what we decided to do is, instead of allowing the industry to go and do a mandate and pick out whoever they wanted to do business with, we felt that we could best serve the industry and the passengers by negotiating on behalf of the entire industry when we sat down with Visa, MasterCard, and Amex. It's better to negotiate on behalf of 13,237 cabs than it is to let the industry become fragmented. So we used new rules that were put into the Procurement Policy Board regs that said you can do such innovative procurements. And another one that's out there, everybody see the bus shelters that are out there with Samusa? You know, these were new rules that were never tested before. And we used this procurement, and we could have gone with an exclusive vendor, like if you've been following the Taxi of Tomorrow, which was my idea. I didn't make the selection, but I felt very strongly that it needs to be an exclusive contract, because a manufacturer to sell a couple of thousand vehicles a year is not going to spend the time unless they're going to get a good contract. Here we opted not to go for exclusivity, and the reason we did it that way is because we wanted to make sure that with the drivers always complaining about how things are so expensive and the owners, and we wanted to drive the cost down, and it worked. We initially had 4 vendors of about maybe, I don't know how many, maybe 6 or 8 that bid on the contract that we selected, knowing full well that maybe 2 or 3 of them, or maybe 2 of them at least, might go out of business and not make it. And that's kind of what happened. And the only remaining vendors that are left now is a company that now has been merged into and acquired by Verifone, which is one of the largest payment transaction companies that you could find anywhere. They're all over Gristedes and all the different supermarkets and gas stations, and a company that was a startup called Creative Mobile Technology. So they're basically in every city now, all around the world, and it all started here. And the benefits that the drivers get from this system, after we got them all installed and all the contracts were entered into, they get business opportunities. It hasn't been fully tested, but we all know it's hard to get a cab at certain parts of the city, right? That's a big debate going on now. So you get off the cruise ship terminal in Red Hook, and you need to get somewhere, and there's no cabs around. We can actually plug into the system a command which will find all the available cabs within a certain radius, and we've used this before. We've used it for big events in the city to alert cabs that there's a business opportunity waiting for you. So you're deadheading back from, let's say, somewhere in Brooklyn back into the city. You'll be diverted and get a fare as opposed to not having a fare. Emergency information, whether it's a blackout or a flood or a snowstorm, giving directions, to drivers on the street. When I was at the city, unfortunately, it had to be put into effect, but I drafted a taxi portion of a strike contingency plan, and we had a strike when I was there. And I wish we would have had these devices when we had the strike, because we would have been able to really better communicate with the drivers. But in the future, if there is a strike, I think the contract's up soon, I hope not, but if there is, these sources will be available. Passenger benefits. Lost property return, it's needle in a haystack previously. Now you can just say where you got out of the cab, we can track it down, narrow it down, and send them text messages and get your property back. It's led to bigger tipping. Studies have shown that tips went up from 10% to over 20, 25%. If you push the button, you'll see that there are not many options. It says 15, 20, 25, $2, $3. I didn't do that. That was the industry. And usage went up. And it wasn't until we put them in all the cabs that usage went from, like, the pilot programs. We had a couple of hundred cabs for years. It never went anywhere. When people got used to it, just like you go into the supermarket, you're gonna swipe your debit card or whatever for $2 or $3 transaction. Everybody's using it. It's over 50% now, from what I understand, in terms of usage, which is great. It also has safety benefits for drivers. They don't have to carry cash around and get robbed. People either love or hate this. You have news, information in the back. Some people get dizzy, nauseous. So once you get, I think a student had mentioned earlier, the cell phones, on subways. There's cell phones in cabs has always been a big issue. We passed the toughest law in the United States, and we were the first, other than Brooklyn, Ohio, to pass a law at TLC banning hands-free cell phones as well. And the US DOT Secretary is very happy about that, but a lot of people don't know that, but they still yap away anyway. So you got a lot of noise pollution inside a cab. You got a cabbie on the phone, and now you got these devices, but you can turn them off if you can find the off switch. Why we're here, data collection. All right, now this gets a little interesting. There were a couple of contracts, going to the legal aspect of this. We had a contract between the TLC, the government entity, and a couple of point-of-service vendors. I mentioned two of them, right? Verifone and CMT. So it was one master contract between us, and then they have contracts with the people that they're signing up in the industry, the medallion owners. Okay? They cut their deals, so there's really 3 contracts involved. My understanding and my recollection is that we did not maintain ownership over the rights to the data, but the point-of-service folks did. Or the medallion owners did. I forget which one, but it wasn't the TLC. We got rights to access that information and actually develop dashboards and ways to sort that information to use it for the purposes that we need them for, like returning lost property. But we were basically using the proprietary systems that they developed for us. And what we only asked for was fair information and some very, very distinct variables. We used to have something called trip sheets. So if you remember, the drivers used to write down, well, a lot of times they didn't do it, you know, where they picked someone up, what time, where they went. We call it now the electronic trip sheet. And everything that was being captured manually is now available to the TLC and to other agencies, like the DOT has used the data. They had to buy it from Verifone after we tried to you know, get it into their hands. But long story short, the data is there, and it's a wealth of information for dealing with the industry when they say, well, you know what, we're not making that much money. And we can tell them, you know what, you're wrong. We have the average rate of fare. We can figure out where the pickups and drop-offs are being made. We used it when we did our group ride taxi cab experiment a couple of years ago to see where people are going. And Professor King and I will, you know, be happy to make available a copy of our paper. And Professor Peters from Staten Island College have just authored a paper that really analyzes millions and millions of pieces of data. You know, you have basically 500,000 trips per day, and we ran it through a supercomputer at the City University of New York. And the way that you can use this data is for transportation planning as well. You could actually, because New York City is so densely populated in the CBD, when Mayor Bloomberg and Commissioner Sadik-Khan, who was, I know, here this morning, announced whether the pedestrian plazas were a success or not, they looked at taxi cab data. You know, they basically took the data that we had to determine what the speed of the other vehicles were, because you can develop a formula to do that. And when you hear breadcrumb data, what the breadcrumb is the GPS pinging the cab from the point of start to finish. The TLC, for political and legal reasons, only got access to the pickups and the drop-offs because we envisioned that there would be lawsuits, which did happen, and we won. And I think the reason we won them because we were smart about it, and we listened to the New York Civil Liberties Union and had a meeting with them, and they got very mad at me afterwards, but we said, what don't you like about this program? And they told us all the issues were, and we solved all their issues, and we put in our contracts specific language that said the TLC doesn't want to have access to cabs off duty. We don't want to know what you're doing. We don't care, you know. We don't want to become an issue in your divorce proceeding because, you know, off duty you were visiting the wrong place or you know, we don't want to be involved in that. So what we did is we put that, and that language saved us. And at the public hearing, when the taxi drivers were striking because they had amnesia, we passed the fare increase, and then it took 2 years to implement the program. So what they did is they tried to strike, and they had the rat outside my office, claiming that we were, you know, using GPS to track their whereabouts, and oh boy, we got to move on. But anyway, long story short, the New York City Liberties Union was not very happy that I produced a letter at a public hearing telling them, hey, you agreed to this, and then they went and they sued us anyway. So we covered some of this. This is where the direction of taxis are going. Smart taxis, you know, there's content advertising, location-based advertising, so you're passing by a storefront, and an advertisement will pop up for that storefront in the back. And it could be used for law enforcement as well. You know, the TLC could use it to track whether people are being overcharged by going to different parts of the city and being charged the wrong rate of fare, whether you're going through the easy pass lanes like you're supposed to as a cab driver. But look, you know, we could use it for all sorts of DOT-related functions. Any lawyers in here? We got one. Law students? Aspiring lawyers? Backseat lawyers? Okay. All right. So I'll start from the beginning. Everybody knows that a police officer can't enter your house without a warrant, right? Now, what happens if you say, okay, it's okay to come in? You know the answer. consent is a waiver to the Constitution's Fourth Amendment guarantee against unreasonable searches and seizures. I'm going to go back very quickly to the beginning, some Supreme Court precedent involving privacy rights, Katz versus U.S. In 1967, the court decided that subjective expectation of privacy accepted by society as reasonable, involving an eavesdropping device on a payphone, and U.S. versus Knotts, which found that no reasonable expectation of privacy is expected in an automobile that's on the public thoroughfare. So you see Gawker and all these people taking pictures on the street. You don't really have a reasonable expectation of privacy, you know, on the public streets, right? I mean, that's part of the issue here. Now, there's a big distinction which needs to be drawn between, you know, criminal cases, obviously, and civil matters. But there's another case that came about involving the Fourth Amendment and GPS specifically, and that's U.S. versus Maynard. There was GPS tracking of 2 individuals that were suspected of dealing narcotics over an uninterrupted 28-day period. The circuit court below, which is right above the trial court, that's as far as it went, distinguished from the prior case, noting that there was prolonged surveillance involved. All right, so they look at the amount of surveillance. Is it a quick snapshot, or are you really, without a warrant, tracking people using GPS or some other electronic device to know their whereabouts, such that they don't reasonably anticipate or expect it? The court did hold that the search was unreasonable, but also acknowledged in this case that there's no right to privacy on public roads based upon what a reasonable person expects. You should know that, for those who aren't lawyers, that, you know, sometimes the New York State constitutions or the state constitutions go further than what the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Constitution says. But there's a very similar case at the New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York State, called People versus Weaver, which is very well known, which involved a 65-day, 24-hour surveillance of a van using a GPS device by police without a warrant. The court noted that this was pervasive and invasive, the use of GPS surveillance, and found reasonable individuals would not expect this level of intrusion into their daily lives. So again, we're looking at the time factor. Now, here's a lawsuit that was brought against me, and we won. It's called Alexander versus TLC. After we passed and promulgated the rules implementing the TPEP project I spoke about, we basically had a couple, there were like 2 or 3 medallion owners that refused to put it in. There was literally like just a handful of them. And they brought a lawsuit, and they argued that, the 2 things, that there was a Fourth Amendment right of privacy breach in us using GPS in the vehicles, and also a Fifth Amendment taking. So we basically, the TLC contracts, we explained that already, but when the court applied the Fourth Amendment, it said there's no legitimate expectation of privacy when information is readily available for public scrutiny. And using the Knotts decision and relying on it that we mentioned previously, held that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy of a motor vehicle traveling on a public roadway. It used what's called an intermediate level of scrutiny and relied very much on the public's interest involved. And you know, basically, the arguments are similar in the Fifth Amendment context. In the Fifth Amendment context, it's something called the taking, right? Somebody wants to condemn your property to build a stadium, you know, in Atlantic Yards or whatever. You know, when that happens, they have to, you know, give you just compensation. But sometimes regulations, like TLC regulations, can amount to what's called a taking because it's depriving you of the economic benefit of your property interest. And medallions are property interests under the law. Long story short, there was a similar program that was passed in Philadelphia, and for similar reasons, you know, basically it was upheld there too. So the court, you know, denied a preliminary injunction, and in both the Alexander case and the Philadelphia case, the court, in addition to, you know, the various arguments that were put down, looked at the public good that was to be done. So it wasn't really like the criminal cases where they're looking at the extent to which someone's being surveilled. This is not about surveillance. This is, you know, we're using GPS for good things, returning lost property, emergency situations. And the public good was one factor, and also it's a highly regulated industry, that there's so many rules and regulations that apply. And what lessons do we learn from this? Regulatory bodies like the TLC and possibly others stand on firm legal privacy grounds as compared to criminal law enforcement, and a whole other lecture could be given on employers using GPS to track their employees, which is a little bit different. Government regulators should clearly define the use of their data via regulation and their contract. We did that, and it saved us in the lawsuit. Okay, and it was a political move because I knew the CLU and the drivers were going to protest, and we thought ahead, and we were successful in doing that. And you know, the unresolved issues, which I can't opine on, which haven't been tested by the courts, are can the TLC use off-duty data? Okay, and I can tell you that data has been used, and I can't go into the details, to stop terrorist attacks. And even though I told them initially we weren't going to use law enforcement, data for law enforcement, it is being used, and it's a good thing in my opinion. And it's being done with a warrant of cost. And that's pretty much it. I'll be happy to answer questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, Ken, but that's it. Thank you.
Terrific. It's good. We gave the secret lawyer handshake there as we cross paths. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Francisco Rojas. You're here. There you are. There you are, right in front of me. Come on up. Francisco Rojas, our next speaker, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Transparency Policy Project of Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Her research examines the social and political implications of information and communication technologies in the context of urban governance. She has been a researcher at MIT's Sensible City Lab, which I know you've talked about here today. Her PhD is in urban and regional planning from MIT, where she also earned a master's in city planning, and she has a degree from the University of Michigan. So Francisca, please come on up.
Thanks for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here today. So I think my talk is really going to tie to some things that we discussed earlier today. I'm really going to focus on the institutional story of how transit agencies have managed to open up their data to the public, and then kind of what the process has been to kind of deliver that data to individuals and transit riders. And there's an institutional story to be told. There's also one about data ownership and relationship building as well. So it really ties into a lot of the things we've been discussing today, all enabled obviously by new technology. So as I think everyone in this room already knows, urban systems are becoming increasingly digitized, and transportation really has been at the forefront of this. So with intelligent transportation systems over the past 10 years, transit agencies have had the ability to monitor their fleets in real time and identify where their buses, where their trains are. And what this research really looks at is how this information gets delivered to people so that they can also make decisions about how they manage their time and their mobility. So the transit case has really provided us a very rich example for learning about how to deliver information to users more generally, especially as kind of open data initiatives become more and more prevalent in other domains. So lots of cities have open data programs, countries have open data programs. If you go to data.gov, there's hundreds and hundreds of data sets. The question is, what does it take for this data to actually be used in any kind of useful and economically productive way? And so the problem with static transit information like schedules, which is how until very recently was the only way that we could get information about transit, is that they're static, right? They're difficult to read, they're difficult to understand, and most of all, they don't reflect reality. They actually don't tell you where your bus or your train is at the given moment that you need to access that. And with the combined availability of mobile devices and real-time data feeds over the past 2 to 5 years, we've been shifting from getting information about transit from things like this situations like this where we have dynamic mobile interfaces that tell us where the bus is or the train and when it's going to arrive at your stop, and so you can plan your behavior accordingly. This innovation has spread really quickly through the top transit agencies in the US, and so this chart really maps starting at the end of 2005, 2006, all the agencies that have adopted open data standards, both for static, just schedules, which is the GTFS format outlined in blue, and then moving over to real time, which is outlined in red. And it's actually a huge honor to be on the same panel as Bibiana McHugh, who's going to speak to us afterwards, because she's really responsible for that first stop on this chart. She was the one who's responsible for getting schedule data on Google Maps, and she essentially, with her agency, invented the GTFS data standard. And that's one of the big reasons why this diffusion of the innovation has spread as quickly as it has across the transit agencies in the US. Second, there's a clear information gap between schedules and where vehicles actually are. And I think the third factor I would argue, and this is kind of one of the most important findings of the research we've been doing at the Transparency Policy Project, which is actually funded by a UTC grant. I forgot to mention that in the beginning. So now you all know what UTC is through the DOT, is that there's been kind of informal communities of transparency that have really developed around the data, where relationships have come about between the agencies, between the intermediaries of the data, who are software developers, and the end users of the information, in a very kind of rich ecosystem of kind of iterative work in refining the data, figuring out what data sets are most valuable, and how to actually deliver that to end users. So our research is focused on how data goes from the public agencies to the hands of transit riders, and we used 5 transit agencies as cases, and each one kind of falls roughly into different bins of the diffusion of innovation framework set out by Everett Rogers like 40 years ago. And to do this research, I spoke with people at the transit agencies. I also interviewed software developers in those cities, and then lots of kind of web-based research, because there's a lot of evidence of this on the internet. And so this model basically tries to draw out exactly how this got started, how it was that agencies even had the idea to open the data to the public. I think in retrospect it seems really obvious, but the impulse within agencies, and I think within government in general, and I think this gets to what Rachel Sterne was talking about earlier, is that the impulse is to kind of build the whole system nuts to bolts at the get-go and then deliver it to the public. And so a lot of agencies, the first impulse was to actually build the signs that you see in subway stations here in New York or in other places. This is incredibly expensive. It takes a long time to procure. By the time you actually install it, it could be out of date. And so once transit agencies started to put their schedules, for example, on websites or kind of real-time portals to the intelligent transportation systems on their websites, developers who kind of were trying to solve their own problems started scraping the data off of the websites, and agencies started to notice this, and they reasoned, well, this is public information. Well, some of them reasoned this is public information. It actually helps us to have riders have this information, so we should kind of collaborate with them and make sure that the data is accurate. And I have, as an example, a developer that I spoke with in Portland, who was really the leader in all of this, talked about how when TriMet first put up a portal for real-time feeds of their buses, when he commuted in the morning, he had a choice of 3 different bus stops that were, 1 block away from each other. And so every morning he needed to decide between 3 buses to get into work, and the agency built portal didn't quite do the job for him. And so he kind of hacked together a solution on his Trio, because this was before the iPhone. And when he showed it to TriMet, he was also happened to be a transit advocate. He showed it to TriMet, and TriMet was like, hey, this is cool, and found out that Bibiana was trying to open the data from the inside. And he said, Bibiana was pushing to get the data out, and I came along trying to push in, and we were able to break through, and that's kind of what these two arrows represent. You know, that the tools existed on both ends. The idea was, how do they come together, and what's the interface, so that they can really work together to further each other's interest. And so, as I mentioned, some agencies were really receptive to this. Obviously, on the inside of the agencies, there was a lot of deliberation about, we should be, a lot of engineers and agencies, they're, the way they're trained is to build entire systems and have control over entire systems. So there was a little bit, some misgivings within operations, for example, that this could actually work. But some agencies were open to it and recognized that if they actually had control over the data and how people were pulling it off their sites, then people would have more accurate information. And for example, in BOSS, so these are the developer pages that have been put up on transit websites, where developers can go and get all the documentation, access the data sets, and also join communities that, like on Google Groups, where developers actually exchange knowledge and help each other out. And so these agencies don't have the capacity to give technical advice, for example, but they're there as support and as liaisons to the rest of the agency, so that they can understand kind of what the developers need and how the agency can support those developers. Other agencies, like New York, for example, but this was, New York's not alone in this. This was also an issue in DC and in other agencies. They were very reluctant to open their data, and there were several reasons for this. Number one, very risk-averse culture in government and transit agencies as well. They also had really bad data, some of them, right? And so for example, the shapefiles in DC were inaccurate enough to be useless in terms of geolocating a bus stop. And so before they could open any of their data, they actually had to go physically geolocate every single bus stop in the city. There's 12,000 bus stops. So that took a long time, and they had to actually contract out for that work. There were proprietary restrictions on the data, so a lot of agencies actually didn't even own the data that was being generated for them through vendor contracts. And so as this process matured, a lot of the agencies have actually renegotiated the contracts and noticed that it's actually, they actually need to own their own data in order to share it with third parties. And so a lot of that work had to happen inside of the agencies and negotiating new vendor contracts before they could share it with third parties. And finally, there was a desire to monetize the data as well. So the context for a lot of these agencies is that they're very cash strapped, and they saw this, they didn't have the perspective that, data on public transit is a public good. They thought that they maybe could make some money off of it. And so this is, a report from here in New York, where a developer was screen scraping the MTA's website for commuter rail data, just the schedules, and had built an app off of it. And the agency told them to basically stop, and if he wanted to sell this app in the App Store, he had to license the data. Eventually, MTA dropped the suit because they got so much bad publicity out of it and saw that other agencies in the US weren't going down this route. And so just to kind of summarize how each agency got to open data, there was pressure both within the agencies. There were champions within the agencies that were really pushing their organizations in this way, but there was pressure from outside, where local techie constituencies were pushing for this as well and seeing what was happening in other cities. And inside the agencies, these champions have been really important. So here we have a photo of Bibiana, also Mike Frumin's in here, talking about kind of who was the champion in each of these places. And as I talked to them, I realized that they actually all were talking amongst themselves and learning from each other's experiences. And this has been really an important part of the learning process and the maturing process with open data in transit. And so you really need to have these, as I call them, these communities of transparency, where the disclosures of the data, the agencies kind of learn from each other, and they need to work together with software developers, and the developers also learn a lot from their end users. And so there's this kind of iterative process of kind of learning from each other, figuring out what data is important, troubleshooting the data. The data is not a static thing. It's not, you know, a file that you get once, especially in transit, and especially with real-time feeds. It's dynamic. It lives, it grows, and agencies have been kind of opening their data in batches as they refine their systems, as they improve their data, and as they get more and more rights to their data as well. And so now transit agencies, we're at a point, really see developers as an extension of what they do, as an extension of their mission to reach customers. This is just an example of kind of what that community looks like. This is, I think the text might be a little bit too small, but in Boston, you had DOT actually draft relationship principles for their interaction with developers. Now, this isn't a binding contract, but it's kind of an agreed upon set of norms that they're going to try to aspire to. And I think the two most important ones have been this: communication is key, that there's constant communication between the different players in the community, and open, you know, make your apps open source, share with other developers in the community what you're learning. Let's learn together and let's evolve the system together. And since this is about, you know, as a legal panel, I thought I'd throw up the terms of use. And so while there's a recognition that a mutually beneficial relationship exists between agencies and developers, all the terms of use explicitly state that the use of open data by third parties doesn't imply an endorsement by the agency or a partnership with the agency, and also exempts the agencies from any liability should the data break or disappear for any reason. And you know, they're pretty consistent. Some of them vary in terms of kind of the use of the trademark, the actual logo. In Chicago, you can use the logo. In Boston, you can't. In New York, you actually have to pay for it if you want to add the logo to your app. And then just to kind of talk about the data uptake in the different agencies, you have per, you know, numbers of ridership, you really have the highest uptake in Portland and in Boston. In Portland, there's one app per 7,000 riders. In New York, for example, while there's the most number of apps, you have one app per 178,000 riders. And I think what's been really important is this kind of, is the developer relationship. There's very strong developer relationships between agencies and the developer community in Boston and Portland. The agencies have actually fostered this community. The people at the agencies who work with the developers know them by name. They go out to lunch together. They convene them whenever there's a new data set they're about to release. They actually have them, you know, do beta tests of the data and refine the data together. And I think where you have the weaker relationships, you don't have as strong of a sustainable model in terms of open data. And you know, this question, what motivates developers to actually take the data and deliver it to people? Number one, I think, you know, they're hacking solutions to their own problems. So the transit data is very salient. It actually affects a lot of people. And these guys, you know, mostly guys were transit riders, and they wanted to know, and they wanted to modify the data in ways that actually, you know, met their needs. The transit data also kind of has a first mover advantage. It was really the first piece of data where people could use to learn to code mobile apps. So a lot of developers took that as a challenge and saw that this data existed, and that's why there's so many transit apps. And then some are inspired, you know, the usual profit from the apps marketplace, but that's really been secondary. That's been the least important reason. And then the one that's interesting for me is the civic innovation reason, which you know, talks about how, you know, people want, you know, the developers want to build community, or they want people to ride transit more, and they want, you know, they want to facilitate that through writing code. And that's just resulted in a lot of different ways for people to get information. So many more ways than you could imagine a transit agency ever coming up with on their own. They neither have the tech capacity or the scale of creativity. And just to finish up here, one of the fears for opening the data from the transit agencies was that they were going to be held accountable for the quality of their service. And that actually hasn't really happened. And the kind of few instances that we've seen have been very unsystematic. This one, the point of this site in Chicago is to actually show people how well the transit system works and how few delays and alerts there really are. And then this one is just kind of more funny than anything else. very unsystematic holding of transit agencies accountable. And then as we saw earlier, the rider effects, anecdotally we know that people really like these apps. If you look at the comments on app stores, people say, you've changed my life. And that's the part that we're looking at with Candy to look at it more statistically. And there's one study in Chicago that does show, back to a question that someone asked Mike Frumin this morning, there's one study in Chicago that shows a moderate increase in ridership, but it's most likely of existing transit riders. It's not getting new people on the bus, but it's getting people who already were in the system to ride more often. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. You just make me want to go and download some apps. I'm excited. And by the way, we're all going home on the orange line today. So just want to let you know that. Bibiana McHugh, our next speaker, comes to us from Portland, Oregon, where she has worked at the TriMet Information Technology Department for the last 14 years. Sound about right? And heads a team of innovative web developers dealing with some of the very same issues that we've been looking at today. And she also brought to the task her own experiences of traveling extensively and experiencing many different transportation systems, many different modes of transportation, and seeing inequitable levels of transportation information. And so she brought those experiences with her to her position in Portland, where she also, through her own perseverance and persistence, worked with Google to be able to urge Google to initiate the beginning of the Google Transit system and the access to transit information through Google, which is a terrific accomplishment in itself. And so, Bibiana, thank you very much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. Here we go. There we go. Awesome. All right, thank you. I'm both very delighted and honored to be here today. I'd like to talk a little bit, basically summarizing a lot of what you've heard today and kind of reiterating a lot. A little about open data and a new project we just launched that kind of pulls together open data and open source software. And I can talk about some of the legal issues that we battled with both of those. But not all agencies, because they don't release their data, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to. In the transit industry, as within city governments, there's a lot of vendors with proprietary software, stovepipe solutions, and they're governed by contracts, old contracts. And a lot of these contracts prohibit the agencies from actually sharing their data. So we encourage a lot of the agencies, when getting in new systems, to actually look at their contracts and look for language such as this data can only be used for internal reporting purposes, or you need an additional right to use license if you want to expose it for external development. And another important thing is the back-end data. I think a lot of people don't realize the complexities of transit data. It has both the spatial and then temporal aspect to it. And it really requires a relational database to manage and maintain the data. However, historically, this is what you see in a lot of the transit agencies and in a lot of city governments, where you have interfaces, multiple interfaces between all the systems. This doesn't really facilitate real-time information or open data information. And most agencies, when they start working with real-time information, like next arrival information, they go to a more database-centric approach as opposed to an application-centric approach. So you can see here in blue is our enterprise database, and all the yellow systems are external systems that maintain or manage the data within our centralized database. There's an interface specified between each of these, and it's usually one way. Then we have a data prep or a generation that goes to all the downstream systems, so information is consistent. When you look at our website, it's the same as our current GTFS data feed. It's the same as our timetables. It's the same as what's on our trip planner. And it really facilitates both real-time information and consistent information between the agencies. And I might mention too that our web services, we have quite a few web services for both our trip planner, which you'll see, and also for our real-time data. They were actually developed for internal purposes, and we merely exposed them. So it's really not a lot of work for, I think, agencies to expose their data. It's more political and legal in many aspects. So Open Trip Planner, I'm very excited to share this with you. You heard a lot about biking just in the last section, and in TriMet there's a lot of bikers, and we have a proprietary transit trip planner that plans transit-only trips. One of the most requested features is to plan bike to transit trips. We've got a lot of bikers out there. There was no solution for us. The only other multimodal trip planner in the country is in Chicago, and they purchased a German off-the-shelf system that cost in excess of $1 million. Well, we just didn't have that. So we knew we needed a multimodal trip planner, and we decided to do it open source because we wanted a solution that wasn't just viable for TriMet, but we wanted a solution that other agencies could also use. And this is just a little bit about open source software. Not all open source software is the same, just like not all commercial software is the same. And when you're analyzing and looking at the alternatives, you really need to do your homework. One of the advantages of open source software is you tend to have a broader developer base, broader user base, more eyes on the code. It also you tend to have more control over it. I use the example of our interactive system map. If I want a new feature on there, I can pay for it, or it's included in my annual licensing fees. This is very different from the old model of kind of crossing your fingers and hoping that that bug is fixed in the next release. You tend to have much more control, but that's assuming that you do have a broad user base. So we knew that this was very important when developing an open source multimodal trip planner that was to be used by many other people. So we partnered with Open Plans, whom you've heard about today. Open Plans is a nonprofit based here in New York, and they specialize in open source software and the basically maintenance and support of open source software. And we partnered with several other developers, David Emery from 5 Points, Brandon Martin Anderson from Graph Server, and Brian Ferris from One Bus Away, which you've heard of this morning. These developers had all developed some aspect of a multimodal trip planner, but they kind of realized that they couldn't do it by themselves and that they didn't want to support it by themselves. So the first year of development, again, I received a grant for $68,930, and we used all of it within the first year. It went very quickly, but we got a lot done in that first year. And we basically started by bringing all the developers in. There was about a dozen different transit agencies that came in who were interested in participating, and Open Plans facilitated it. From that, we had a roadmap, project management plan, et cetera, et cetera. We used an open source development method at opentripplanner.org. You could basically see all the progress that's been done over the last 2 years and who did it. A lot of documentation up there. We used an open architecture. And by default, Open Trip Planner uses all open data. It uses 3 data sets: the general transit feed spec for the transit data, the USGS National Elevation Data Set, and OpenStreetMap, which is a seamless, routable network that's worldwide. It's kind of like the Wikipedia of maps. And again, by default, OpenStreetMap uses these 3 data sets to build a very intelligent, routable network. Why did we choose? When we went out there, there were other options. Rather than using OpenStreetMap, we've also got very rich jurisdictional data in our area. We also could have purchased an existing data set from, say, TeleAtlas or Navtech. Our jurisdictional data ends at the county boundaries. We wanted this to be seamless because we want it to grow. We're already working with adjacent agencies on expanding it to a regional trip planner. Commercial products are very costly. They have annual licensing fees. For instance, it would have cost us $25,000 to lease one of the commercial base maps for a year. Instead, I use that for business justification to hire 4 college students to use our jurisdictional data and aerial photography to improve OpenStreetMap. And this is basically what they did over a 6-month time period. On the left, you can see kind of the historical centerline file, which is most notably used for geocoding purposes. And on the right is more of a routable network. It's got a lot more line work in it, but less attribution. It's lighter weight. It's got a lot of inherent attribution to it. So they basically improved the geometry, added in a lot of information, corrected a lot of information, and verified directionality for bicycles and turn restrictions. Now, the other most amazing thing is, although we ran out of money the first year for development, people from around the world started picking up on this. And these are all the things, not all the things, but quite a few things that have been done over the last couple years by developers, again, all over the world, including Open Plans, contributing their code, contributing fixes, contributing additional features and enhancements. For instance, the application has been translated from English into 7 languages now. And this really demonstrates the advantage of open source software. Right now, we have demonstrations and actual implementations running in, I think, about 9 countries now. And in Portland, we officially launched the, we're calling it the Regional Trip Planner, rtp.trimet.org is where you can find it. We launched it on October 15th. It has 5 new features. We were intentionally trying to keep the number of features down to reduce the learning curve. But over here under bicycle, in addition to the transit modes, you can also travel by walking, biking, or bike to transit. We also have a bike preference triangle, which I'll show you, an elevation chart, car share locations, and again, it's using all open data. There's a lot of advantages to it. I won't go into all of them, but one of the most interesting one is something that kind of surprised us, something that we weren't anticipating. But the great thing about college students is, you have all this data and they come back with pie charts and databases and spreadsheets and all kinds of analysis. And when I saw this, it really I knew we were on to something. But this kind of shows the travel times in comparisons. We were comparing our multimodal trip planner against our existing trip planner with regards to transit trips. With regards to multimodal trips, there wasn't really anything to compare it to, but we wanted to see if there were any benefits. So we compared, again, the new regional trip planner, bike to transit trips, against Google Transit trips and our existing proprietary trip planner. And what we discovered is that you can save a significant amount of travel time. For instance, in traveling from Beaverton High School to Cedar Hills Transit Center, if you bike to transit, what the trip planner is doing is it's going out there and it's very intelligently looking for the quickest arrival time and routing you to that transit stop. So even if you're an experienced bicyclist, you're not going to know the system enough to actually get you to a destination as quickly as possible. If you take this same trip by transit only, it's going to take you on Google Transit estimates it's going to take you about 20 minutes in comparison to 5 minutes. And if you plan it on our proprietary trip planner, it doesn't plan it at all by default because there aren't any stops within walking distance. We're continuing this a little bit further, and I think that this is something that I'm hoping a lot of other governments start looking at, the potential to use OpenStreetMap, not just for routing purposes, but for operational purposes as well. We can save a lot of money by all using an open base map and save significant amounts of money. Plus, we're putting money into a product that the public can benefit from. So I'm keeping the interns on for another 3 months, and we're actually adding in all attribution for vehicular routing, so we could use this for our bus dispatch purposes and for our MDT vehicles as well. And just the QC process, we're actually working with the local police departments and printing out maps by police precinct. They, of all people, are the experts on speed limits and turn restrictions and directionality, and they're very, very happy to be collaborating and working with us. So, with that, I'd like to show you the new trip planner. This is it right here. And you can actually key in okay, great. Metro. Sorry. I can pull this out? Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. Okay. Let's say you work at Metro and you want to get to our new field house. There we go. This is a typical transit trip. Now, again, we can bike and transit, and let's say you're running a little bit late, so you want to plan your quickest trip. So this is going to take you, again, the most direct route, and the elevation of the land is actually down here. Now we can come over here, and let's say you want to go the safest route. You've got your kids with you. And this is actually going to plan your trip through a multi-use path on the bottom of the steel bridge and through the park. And then, if you're a little bit tired, you can also plan a flattest trip and reduce the level of elevations that are there. Another neat thing is car share locations. So, in Portland, we've got zip cars are very popular, especially with the college students. In fact, all of the students I hired, they don't even own cars. They use a combination of car sharing, like zip cars, and bicycling and transit. So this is really helpful to be able to actually see all the car share locations and immediately plan a transit trip or a bicycle trip to the zip car locations. And we're currently, just like with Google, working with Zipcar on a real-time API. Right now, this information is accurate, but it's static. It doesn't show the reservations. So that's one of the new features that'll be coming out in the next few weeks. Again, this is all open source software, all open data, and there's a lot of students out there on the website. If you go to opentripplanner.org, there's tutorials on how to get it up and running, and I bet somebody here could get it up and running in New York in less than an hour. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the elegance of this site really matches, in many ways, the elegance of the transportation system, which I had the privilege of experiencing very recently in Portland. So thank you to our three speakers. Come on up. Let's raise the lights. And we will open this up for discussion and your questions.
One question from Twitter.
All right.
Hi, my name's Anthony Townsend from the NYU Rudin Center. My question's for Francisca, actually. The chart that
Where are
you
you? There you
Hi.
are.
The chart that you showed about developer relationships, the two that had the strongest were the two that have been doing this for the longest. Is it time? Is it just experience? Or is there some other institutional factor or city size or what?
Yeah, I think the later agencies have benefited from the experience of the earlier agencies, so that definitely is something to consider, and I think it's a contributing factor. That, you know, I think a lot of energy has to go into kind of building up the system, but then as it matures, you know, if, you know, apps are open source at the beginning of the system, then others can take that up and adapt it to their cities. Though, you know, with the software developers I talked to, I asked them, you know, a surprising part of it has been that a lot of the apps developed and a lot of the solutions developed with the data have been very local, right? So in talking with developers, I was like, well, you know that these other agencies have the same format, same data, you just have to adapt it for the other city. Would you be interested in doing that? They're like, no, you know, I mean, it's really about solving their problems and, you know, their friends, and they're happy to just keep it local. There's one developer who used his same app at University of Michigan with the Michigan bus system because he had traveled there to go visit a friend and he wanted it to work there. So it's been surprising for me that they're not trying to kind of capitalize on the work that they've already done and capitalize on the data standard, because it would be easy to just kind of, you know, apply to another place. But that definitely is kind of a maturing learning curve aspect of it. And in New York, I was actually surprised at how many apps there are, given that there's only one real-time bus route. Apparently that's a product of there being lots of apps contests, and apps contests generate a lot of transit apps because it's the low-hanging fruit. Two, because apparently more than half of them are trip planners, reflecting that the MTA's trip planners not very easy to use, and people are looking for their own solutions for that. And then the third reason is anticipating the real-time rollout of other buses in the city. So they built an app for the B63, anticipating that they'll kind of add to it once the rest of the system goes online.
Really interesting. Look around the room. Questions? Yes? Yes, please. We have microphones coming your way.
Oh, great.
Please introduce yourself.
My name's Anna, and I'm a student at GSAPP. And there was a question this morning that I want to repose to you guys. It was when Janette was speaking, and I think it's better suited for this session. Is there, amongst these apps and sort of trip planners, is there any way for people to complain? I know that, I'm sorry, Francesca, right? You mentioned that cities were afraid if they released their data that they would be criticized. Do any of these cities have systems where you can give feedback about a bus not showing up or a train not, you know, information not being posted?
Yeah, that's increasingly happening on Twitter. But when it happens through the apps, it's actually been, I think, maybe an unintended but very clever consequence for the agencies that people believe that it's the apps that don't work and not that the data feeds are not working. And all of the apps are getting the exact same data from the agencies. And all of the apps tend to have feedback buttons so that the developers are getting all the feedback. And some of them have begun to kind of standardize the data and pass it on to the agencies, and that has been actually a really useful process for the agencies as well to improve their data feeds, but also to get kind of distributed information about their systems that they're not seeing that people on the ground are seeing.
Question over here? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Josh Mandel. I'm a student at NYU Wagner, and I also work at the Rudin Center. So my question is, I guess, for Francesca and Bibiana, concerning open data, real-time data. I guess in just technical terms and definitions, you know, it's very easy to say open data and real-time data. And I'm just in your experience, from your perspective, what really constitutes open data? I mean, you know, currently a city go-around, I think that you have to basically have your routes, location stops, and I forget what else it is. in the GTFS format. But I don't think that there are any real requirements in terms of how often you have to update it. Same thing for real-time data. On City Go Around, they say that there are about, I think, 6 out of 900 agencies in the country that have quote-unquote real-time data. Is real-time within the minute, within the hour, the day? Is open data meaning that you updated it once that year? Because I'm sure that there are, tons of agencies who haven't updated it in the last, 4 months. So.
I can answer one aspect of that. We don't, believe it or not, we really don't try and police how our data is used. And we don't really try and tell the developers how to develop or anything like that. Like, for instance, our apps page, we have 45, 50 applications listed up there. And at first we started out with a long list of criteria for what applications go up there, and we narrowed it down to 3. The app has to work like it says it does. It doesn't necessarily have to work really well. I mean, one of the apps, PDX Bus, that receives 100,000 hits from us a day now, started out not very good. We don't want to be exclusive. We want to give everyone the same opportunity. And it has to use our terms of use. We just want to make sure that the people know that the application, who owns the application and where the data is coming from. And that's basically it. But we don't really get into policing it. We believe that competition is going to weed out the bad applications and make the good applications even better. And I think that aligns with an open data policy. An open data is an open data set that is freely and openly accessible to anyone. You can charge money for it. You can make money off of it. That's fine. It's not for us to say, how to do it or what you do with it. But we feel as though it is our responsibility as a government agency to make it available and to kind of discourage screen scraping. We really want the developers to be using our resources and not screen scraping the data, so they are always getting the most accurate information that's out there.
I want to ask the question. I want to ask sort of the same question, only with my spin on it. And that is, I deal a lot with open source, open access, open data. These are a lot of the issues I work with in many different contexts. And the definitional issue is really important. To one person it means one thing, and to another it means something different. And one critical difference is, does it mean ability to have access to the information that you are making it available? Or does it mean that if there are legal rights, like copyright, for example, associated with it, you're waiving those? Because I'm kind of hearing that you're not doing that. Because you say, Bibiana, you said people may use the data subject to terms of use. Mm-hmm. And when you say subject to terms of use, I see that as you're asserting some kind of right to ask people to be obliged to follow these rules.
Right.
And that means you're asserting something. So are you making it available, or are you letting it go, or how else might you describe what's going on here?
Our terms of use are this for static data. Is the same terms of use that applies to any of our other data on our TriMet.org site. It's no different than any of the other data on our site. And really the objective is, again, for the customers, it's important that the customers understand that the application isn't TriMet's, it's the developers, but the data is coming from TriMet.
So let me push you a little bit further. Are the terms of use something that you feel that you could really go back after somebody about if they didn't follow them, or are these just rules of the club?
We really haven't had any issues. I mean, people are very respectful of them.
I want to push you further. All right, I'm an abuser. What are you going to do to me?
I would probably ask if you were free for lunch and explain to you
I get a
the
free lunch
advantages
by abusing your rules?
and explain to you the advantages of complying to our terms of use and why we have them out there and come to some mutual agreement.
Thank you. Comments from others?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The underlying data, you know, I'm sure MTA made it available. I know, you know, for app competitions, so to speak, that you can build your platform on that public data. But there's also something called the Sunshine Law, the Freedom of Information Law. And if you push the envelope, I think the way the rules read, you know, if they didn't make it available, you can get it. It's public as long as they don't have to write a program, if they have a program already written and the data is available. I mean, for instance, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, you could FOIL that data. It'll take 1 million years for them to sit down with you and get it to you because it's complicated.
You better explain what FOIL means.
FOIL is a Freedom of Information Law request. You know, so if you want any public record from the government, you can get it. So if you're looking to develop apps, I mean, the TLC, even before I left, we made it available to people. So it's available just like the MTA did. You know, some of my students in my classes, we've had discussions about, you know, and I didn't see any taxis on the trip planner, but, you know, taxis are much more efficient than zip cars, in my opinion. I mean, they're constantly moving. If we can get rid of the cars and have more taxis and do group riding, you know, it would be great, because the reality is in any city, Portland, New York, you know, it's a combination of a livery, a cab potentially, depending on where you're going, 2 fare zones, a bicycle, a bus, a train, and the data is available to do that. And what's happening now is there's a trend in the industry with smartphone applications for taxi cabs. It'd be great if a lot of that data could be dumped into your trip planner, because it exists. There are several companies now that have smartphone applications. You probably heard of them. One's called Uber, Cabulous, Taxi Magic, mostly on the West Coast in San Francisco. That has a similar problem to us, where there's certain parts of the city where it's hard to get cabs. You can actually get one of these apps on your iPhone or smartphone, or Droid, to be fair, and basically request a cab, and in real time, you will see those cabs appearing on your screen. You can click on it, and it will come to you. It's being used, and it's a very controversial thing in the industry, because yellow cabs are one thing. It's one unified system. The livery and limousine companies and taxi cab companies around the country all have, unlike New York, the ability to either be called with a business, with a goodwill and a name and a phone number, where they have their client base, or they can be hailed. New York is the only city where you can hail a yellow cab exclusively. Every other city, it's both. So a lot of the companies are very upset with the company known as Uber, because Uber has no distinction between the various companies. That you have no idea who you're clicking on and who's going to show up. So there's no brand identity. And obviously, if you have a customer client base, it creates all sorts of legal issues, and the companies are very, very upset. But Taxi Magic and some other apps that are out there actually tell you on the screen, you know, this is the cab and this is the company that's coming to you. And it's beyond me why no one has actually developed a website to complain about taxi and limousine services. There's not one that's out there, though you can call 311 in New York City to complain.
Yeah, I saw a hand up in the middle of the room. Yes, please. Right here. There we go. I saw your hand first.
Hi. I have a quick question and a longer question, I think. The quick question is there any research on whether getting real-time info to people makes them smarter or better able to plan routes when they don't have that info available? Like I just don't know if there's been any research on, okay, take the phone away, and then how well are they able to plan the route? And the second thing is there any proprietary restriction on saying when, like, is there a patent on saying the next bus is going to arrive in 5 minutes? Is that something that is patentable? That's a question.
The short answer to your question about the patent is in principle, yes. Software, if this is a software-driven system, I assume, is patentable in some respects to the extent that it meets the requirements of being a utilitarian work and so on. So yeah, it is conceivable that that's patentable. You know, a controversial patent that was issued and was thrown into controversy is Amazon.com one-click to buy something. But that was drawn into question because others had used it before. But is it patentable in principle? Yeah, it is.
And
Is clicking the page?
There's a patent on estimated arrival times, which is
There's
No
about 30 of
surprise.
them.
What's that?
There's about 30 of them.
Yeah, there's a lot of them, and they're all held by the same person. So if you look at the B63 arrival, it actually tells you distance and not time, because MTA hasn't licensed the estimate of arrival time, and it instead is doing distance. But NeXus has a license with arrival time, and so you get arrival time.
So what we need next then is a patentable software invention that would tell us the number of minutes until those patents expire so we can get the benefit of it. When will the public domain be arriving? I saw a hand right over here. Yes, please.
Hi, I have a question. I think it's perhaps for Francisca, or it could even be for Bibiana, which is, you know, like PE fund managers, private equity fund managers make rich people richer. So most of these applications that are currently the good apps are basically in good transit territory. These are cities and communities where lots of people have a habit of riding transit in any case, take buses, take trains, etc. On the margins, and I imagine Portland comes probably closest to being that on the margin. It's certainly not Chicago, certainly not Boston, certainly not New York. But on the margin, is there evidence that ridership is up and people that would hitherto be doing something else, worst of all driving, are now actually using transit because this has essentially made it convenient? Because in terms of New York, and even this distance and time thing in New York, I happen to work for the MTA, so I know, I mean, there are all sorts of bus bunching things, there are traffic issues, but at the same time, people in New York care less for schedules because, you know, a bus or a train is going to show up in 6 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever. It really matters where if you miss one, then another one's not going to be there for 14 minutes or whatever that threshold line is. So my question is, in places where transit is not such a popular thing, are apps increasing transit ridership?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, I know of one study that has kind of systematically looked at this and tried to control for other factors that could be increasing ridership, such as, you know, the price of gas or employment, things like that. And they found that only a moderate increase, and most likely that it's riders who were already in the system. They weren't getting new people on. But, you know, the jury's still out. The research is being done as we speak, so hopefully we'll get more evidence.
Mm-hmm. What we do know is that's increasing, though, is customer satisfaction. Especially over the last few years where we've all been strapped and with service cuts and all that. It's really hard to narrow down the many variables. Our ridership has steadily been increasing, but there's so many variables to that, but we do know that it does increase customer satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Let me interject with a question that we got off of Twitter. On the question of how many apps a city has, which ones are laggards, and so on, the question is, does it matter how many apps a city has, as long as that city has a few good ones? Mm-hmm. What's more important, quantity or getting a threshold of quality?
You know, I hadn't thought of that. And I don't know if it matters, right? I think what's been great about the outcomes of this initiative of kind of open data in transit is that, you know, people process information in different ways mm-hmm. and have different needs, and there's a lot of different, you know, there's different, you know, all these apps have different content and different interfaces, and you get to pick and choose, you know, which one suits you best. So in Boston, you know, I have like 5 different apps all loaded on my phone, and I just, you know, through trial and error, I decided I liked one, but that's probably not going to be the same one that, you know, the next person is going to like. So I think having the variety is important, and it doesn't matter how many there are, as long as you have some sense of choice mm-hmm. On how you kind of access the information. And it's not just apps. That's what's been really nice about kind of looking to see what the outcomes have been. It's not just apps. You don't just need a smartphone, right? So people have done, you know, they've built phone numbers where you could just call. You can get it through text messaging. People have actually built physical signs. So there's a lot of do-it-yourself signs in neighborhoods in Boston and Chicago. Chicago actually has instructions on how to build your own sign. So people are building them for their apartment lobbies, so people as they're going out, so I think the variety is important. I don't know if it's the number or the quality, but just having a lot of different outlets that actually you don't have to have a smartphone. It's not exclusive in that way.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you. Question? Yes, please. Down near the front. Right down here.
Thank you all. This is JD Gotcha with Nigel, and I was curious, in both presentations, y'all mentioned data standards as being really important to the facilitation of a number of agencies, sort of climbing on board and doing this stuff. I've worked in the crisis mapping community for a while now, and there's been a lot of discussion about data standards and a lot of discussion about data standards at UN and World Bank and other agencies, and it hasn't really gotten going there. What really made that work here and made the wide adoption of data standards, available going forward to allow the app developers to get going?
For GTFS, I think that it was several things. It was a standard that was very easy to use and easy to understand. It's in a CSV file format. There's nothing complicated about it. Anyone can pick it up and generate it and understand it. And then also a very useful app that customers wanted that was worldwide was using it. And that really encouraged the transit agencies to adopt it. And then it became other things. At first it was just for Google. But I think that that's a good example of how a lot of standards are being developed in this day for a specific purpose. And a lot of them are being developed between public-private partnerships and collaborations. And then it expands to meet more applications. Now, a lot of agencies put their data in the GTFS format, not just for Google Transit, but now there's hundreds of applications out there that they can benefit from. But initially, it was, Google Transit being on board, having your data in Google Maps, and I think the simplicity of the standard, really. Those are the two biggest factors I see as wide adoptions. That facilitated wide adoption.
And I've been advised that time has sneaked up on us, and so I want to, I want to thank the panel on behalf of all of us. Apologies if we've left a few questions hanging, and thank you all very much for being here, and thanks to you. And we'll have some closing comments. So thank you.
We have one more speaker coming up, Anthony Townsend, who I'll introduce, but I want to thank the panelists. I'm not sure that you realize how big open data is. I used to work for a city agency, and I wasn't even allowed to give my data to the person sitting next to me without a series of approval processes. So I think just being able to open it up past the city itself is such a big deal, and then to be able to open up to application developers is even more significant. So the work that they've done to do that is extremely incredible. So I'm going to introduce our next kind of person that I want to end the conference with. And the reason that I asked Anthony Townsend to come speak with us is one of the things we've been talking about, transit and data and kind of new innovations and transit data development. And we started this conversation, the BitCity conference, I think because we've become as a community more interested in data, we've become more data-centric, we've been kind of really enthusiastic about it, but there's a lot of things to consider that we can learn from in the past ways that we've used data to plan our cities that can really help guide us as we think into the future. And one of the reasons transportation as the first conversation for BitCities I think is so great is because transit data has always been kind of maybe one of the more easily acquired data sets, maybe that's the best way to put it. And at the same time, the most controversial, I think, over the history of city planning. And I think it's really important to kind of contextualize where we are right now. We have more data in the world than we've ever had before. We have more potential to make applications to kind of generate programs from that. And so I've asked Anthony kind of to respond to that. So just to give you a background, Anthony Townsend is a research director at the Institute for the Future, where he conducts forecasts on urbanization, mobility, ubiquitous computing, and technologies and innovative ecosystems. His research sponsors include the Rockefeller Foundation, National Science Foundation, California Judicial Council, Research Triangle Foundation of North Carolina, and many Fortune 500 companies. Anthony taught courses on digital urbanism at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications Program, or IPT, which a lot of you are probably familiar with. He has lived and worked in South Korea as an urban planning consultant and a Fulbright scholar, where he has authored several articles on Seoul's broadcast culture and economy. He was one of the original founders of NYC Wireless, a pioneer in municipal wireless movement that promotes the use of public access Wi-Fi in the development of local communities. Anthony holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from MIT's urban planning department, also where he's got his master's from NYU, and, from MIT's, and BA at NYU. So, sorry, I just totally messed that up, and you can fix me. With that, I will let Anthony kind of talk.
Thank you. Wow, big day, right? I've been to a lot of these smart city conferences in the last decade, and sometimes it's just the same people saying the same stuff over and over. This one had tons of new voices and lots of new things. I'm writing a book about this, so I was furiously taking notes all day. But what I want to talk about is shift a little bit from talking about data, how it's created, how it's used, and sort of what that means to how it's moved, and particularly to talk about wireless networks, which I call untethered communications, and why it's such an important thing for cities, and why they're so close. Cities and wireless networks are so closely interrelated, and why it's this sort of perpetual scarcity of wireless bandwidth, and what that's going to mean for us going forward. We talk about this stuff as if it's completely new, and a lot of people who are up here today are people that are inventing new ways of using technology to interact with the city, but we really have to appreciate just how long this opportunity, this challenge, this way of thinking has been around, and it really goes back to the rise of the industrial city. This is a photograph of Ildefons Serda, who was this visionary thinker who basically invented much of modern urban planning in Barcelona in the 1860s and 1870s. This was a time when new technologies for movement and communication were coming out, and he was absolutely fascinated by these things. If you look at his early writings, it's all about the telegraph and the train. And he's got these great, like Victorian quotes, that the calm and tranquil, almost motionless man of the earlier generations that preceded us will be replaced by the active, daring, entrepreneurial man who in a few brief instants travels vast distances, the man who in just minutes transmits and circulates his news, his instructions, and his commands right around the globe. And this is amazing stuff, and it's basically the same stuff that we're talking about now. It's how do you rewire the city to take advantage of these new capabilities? And like a lot of the people in this room, he put his money where his mouth was and built things, designed things that would make that possible. So when he laid out Eixample, which is the new district of Barcelona that was built out around that time, he developed very sophisticated plans for the roads and for the infrastructure conduits that would go underneath them. And he had 4 utilities that he was concerned about. He was concerned about gas, about sewage, and about fresh water. Okay, there was no electrical system at that time. Urban electrical grids didn't come along until the 1870s. And then there was the 4th utility, which was the telegraph. So this is the first time you see actual urban infrastructure for telecommunications being engineered. Fast forward today, and you get people like Wim Elfrink, who's the Chief Globalization Officer. What a title that is, at Cisco. And he calls the network the 4th utility. just like Serta did, which I think is really fascinating. But what's happening to the fourth utility is it's becoming untethered, and I love this word, untethered. It actually comes from an Army report, a US Army report. It's about 15 years ago, where they were talking about sort of how you rethink a highly mobile, highly networked military. And they didn't use the word cellular. Cellular's, I mean, it's the worst word in the world. No one understands what it means, really. It describes this invisible network that we don't really care about as long as it works. Mobile phone, that's the device that doesn't tell you what it does, and it's kind of like a horseless carriage. I mean, in a couple of years, mobile phone's going to be, all phones are mobile. There aren't any fixed phones, so it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. But this is really what's happening, and it's this last couple hundred yards of connectivity to the network that's really where all of the value is being created now, in allowing you to stay in touch on the go and do all these things, access transit information. And again, this is something that people have been thinking about for a long, long time. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but Nikola Tesla was a very important inventor in the early days of electricity and invented a lot of the things that we use today that are in our systems. He actually beat Guglielmo Marconi to inventing a wireless telegraph, or radio as we know it, but it was sort of stolen. And in his later years, he became a mad scientist, and he was penniless, and he actually died in a hotel room alone at the age of 86 in the New Yorker Hotel over by Penn Station. Really sad story, but he was an amazing person. He basically predicted that we would have this global mobile telephone network. A man will be able to carry one in his vest pocket. He said this in 1926 in an article in Collier's magazine. Pretty fascinating precedent for this stuff. So where it went from there, this is the earliest picture that I have of a mobile phone. You know, it's basically the size of a car. And there wasn't that much demand for it. I mean, the telephone network wasn't even that big before World War II. What happened was during the war, they saw how useful radio was in coordinating groups of people, and all these people came back and said, all right, we should have a wireless extension on the phone system. So AT&T built a system, launched in 1946. It was impossible to get one. You know, you had to be connected. It's like a phone system in a developing country, a phone system. You got to know somebody, you got to pay through the teeth, and then you'll get your car phone. There are a few trucking companies that had things like armored vehicles for money. But it was incredibly limited because basically these systems operated off a single tower in the center of a city, and they only had a couple channels that they could use. So in New York, there were just 12 channels. You could only support 2,000 subscribers. This was the biggest system in the country. And you had to basically request a channel, and then the operator would coordinate it. And you know, it wasn't anything like what we have now. So there wasn't enough capacity. So how do you solve that? You start slicing the city up, okay? And basically since then, since the 1950s, the whole evolution of mobile phone technology has been about responding to this insatiable demand that we have to talk to each other on the go and finding different ways to chop the city up. So the first way to do that, this was actually thought up in the 50s at Bell Labs and sat on someone's shelf just moldering for decades until the 70s when they decided to implement it. And that's the idea behind cellular networks, is to just chop the city up, use less power in your transmitter, and reuse the frequencies in non-adjacent cells. So I can use these 12 channels here, I can reuse them again in a different neighborhood. Theoretically, that's what it looks like. This is kind of the ideal world where you had equidistant coverage from every tower. And then because radio signals do all kinds of weird things in urban environments, your actual network looks something much more complex. So that was the first generation of analog cellular, if you remember this. The second generation, what we thought of in the 90s as digital cellular, wasn't about slicing the city up geographically, it was about slicing it up in time. And this is a picture of how digital TV works. You're basically compressing and cramming more channels into the same amount of spectrum. Digital phones, mobile phones work exactly the same way. And basically what you're doing is you're using the white space when people aren't talking and shoving more calls in there. We get to 3G. You know, we're at a period in the early part of this decade where there's millions of people now that want to use these things, and they want to use them for more than just talking, they want to use data. So the strategy becomes, okay, we'll go back and cut the city back up into even smaller microcells, get more spectrum, and do things like that. And this is really important because you know, it's responding to just this completely unquenchable desire we have to be connected while we're on the go. And you guys saw all kinds of examples of that throughout the day. And you can see it in the numbers. I mean, just in terms of how much data people are using around the world. I think what's really fascinating to me about this isn't the technical aspects of how the network's engineered, but the fact that most of the technology for doing this has been around for a long time, and it really took a change in the way cities work to get companies to invest in it and to build it. And in a sense, this isn't something that just fell out of the sky. This is something that we chose as a society. We wanted to be connected on the go, all the time, exchanging lots of information, and these complex systems were assembled to allow that to happen. I think the other thing that's really fascinating is that they reinforce each other. Okay, so the more dense and dynamic cities get, the more demand there is for mobiles to help people coordinate these really incredibly complex lives that they live in megacities, right? I mean, think about how difficult it would be for you tomorrow if the cell phone network didn't work, or if your phone was stolen. You would basically have a crisis of communications. You wouldn't be able to get anything done. Think about if, all of New York City's government workers lost their mobile service one day. I mean, these things happen, and we see during disasters what happens when these networks go down. And you can see it at a macro level. All the visualizations, we saw some today with Waze, but the things that the Sensible Lab has been doing, visualizing cell phone traffic and movement around special events like soccer games. This is how we coordinate the city on a macro scale as well. And so you can see the changes at both levels. What I think is really fascinating, and the discussion that we had this morning around Waze, is Waze going to allow the freeway system to survive and to increase its capacity, even though we're not investing in additional capacity, because people can find ways around the congestion, or they can wait at home and go a little bit later. That means that the same amount of infrastructure can support more people, can support more activity. And just sort of anecdotally, we know that these things allow us to be mobile and to coordinate our lives over much larger distances. If you look at some of the work that, say, Jeffrey West is doing about city size and productivity now, and how they kind of reinforce each other, there's a scenario where these technologies are going to allow cities to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and still hold together without coming apart at the seams. And I think that's something that's really going to be interesting to watch unfold over the next 100 years. And again, this has happened before, okay? Herman Hollerith was a clerk at the Census Bureau in the 1880s. And that was a time when the US was very rapidly urbanizing. Congress was completely freaked out by it, okay? And by 1887, they were still processing the results of the 1880 census. And it wasn't even clear if they were going to get done in time before the next census took place. So Hollerith invented this automatic tabulating machine that basically, they coded the census records on punch cards, and this thing would, the little dials would click and add up all the numbers. And he was actually the first person to get a repetitive stress injury from a computer, okay? And so he designed an apparatus to reduce the amount of effort that you had to do. And they were able to tabulate the 1890 census by the end of the summer, okay? Didn't take 7 years, it took like 3 or 4 months. This went on to become IBM, this device right here. And so I look at this and I say, all right, urbanization, industrial urbanization in the US would not have been possible. We wouldn't have known, we wouldn't have been able to govern these cities without these technologies. And as a result, they've been able to grow very large and very complicated and very productive. So it's happened before, it can happen again. And Tesla was right. The whole Earth is being converted into a huge brain. And all the things are particles of a real and rhythmic whole. I mean, these visualizations that you see of cell phone data and traffic, these things are all coordinated. It's really fascinating to me that he was right. But the problem is we're about to run out of capacity again. Cisco, Ericsson, these big technology companies are forecasting that there's going to be 20, 50, whatever, 100 billion things connected to the internet. 2008 was the year that more than 50% of the world was urban, but it was also the year that there were more things connected to the internet than people. It was also the year that there are more mobile broadband lines than fixed broadband lines. So it's kind of a fascinating situation. And they're going to generate a lot of data, all this telemetry from vehicles and things that you buy. Video is going to kill the mobile networks as well. And Eli Noam here at Columbia, who studies these things, had a great quote in a broadband scenario that the Aspen Institute did. And he said, if you had a quarter of the population of Manhattan watching a video over their handsets, it would take approximately 100,000 cell sites or cell towers, or a huge amount of additional spectrum. So, you know, people complain about cell towers now. Imagine this scenario where basically every building in Manhattan has a cell tower on it. And we're getting close to that. We're definitely headed in that direction. Let me wrap up here. So this is the FCC's spectrum allocation chart. This shows all the radio channels in the United States and who they're assigned to and how they're used. And it's a total mess. I mean, this is like, if you want to see regulation that doesn't work, this is essentially a public domain, a public resource that has been chopped up and given to various different special interests over the last 100 years. And it's almost impossible to undo, except a tiny little bit at a time. And every tiny little bit that tries to get done gets fought back. So the last big battle was over what they call white space. And it's perfect for cell phones. It's a great resource. But there's a very powerful special interest that uses that. Sports stadiums and Broadway theaters, and they use it for their wireless mics. And they were able to stop the rest of us from getting access to that in a very effective battle. But I think there are some ways we're going to go forward. I don't need to explain why you guys care. We know that everyone uses transit. We heard earlier that these networks are now penetrating into transit systems underground. We know all about the apps and the apps. I mean, this is just amazing on the iTunes store, what you can get around transit apps. But it's the data that these devices use, the data that you guys are all producing and finding good uses for. Smartphones use 24 times more data than traditional cell phones. Tablets are even worse because the screens are 4 times as big, so there's 4 times as much data, or 122 times more, depending on who you believe. And this is really what it's come down to now, is that our government is so afraid of these special interests that control the spectrum that they're not asking them to like move or find a new technology or find some better way to use this resource that we have. They're begging them to please participate in these voluntary incentive auctions. And this is mostly aimed at broadcasters, television stations. So they'll give back the airwaves that we gave them 80 years ago for free. And then the FCC will sell them and give them some cut of the money. And it's just a really sad state of affairs. And I think planners are always going into these like sort of adjacent areas of policy. Housing and transportation are things that we work in all the time, but there's a lot of planners that think about fiscal policy, the money supply, how that affects housing. Why don't we think about telecom policy? Why don't we think about spectrum policy? Because this is something that is going to be a fundamental stranglehold on urban growth and our ability to make all these things that you guys are doing actually work for everybody. So I'm just going to leave it there, and go home and lobby your legislator to fight for spectrum reform. Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
I hope I woke that guy up back there.
Maybe I'll start off a little bit. I mean, I was thinking about kind of, what lessons can we learn? And so, kind of you really talking about the telecom policy, right, and kind of illustrating that. Like, how can we think that for other kinds of data too that are starting to be opened up? Not, I mean, obviously this is a big issue that we're realizing now that we're using so much spectrum, but there's probably other areas that we're not thinking of.
Yeah, I think, well, here's the thing is, I think there's some agenda that all the things we've heard about today are creating a tremendous amount of value, right? And it's sort of a similar story to why the federal government put a lot of attention into like internet policy and making sure that the internet wasn't going to look like the phone system did. And I think that some agenda that sort of starts to collect like some of the research that Francisca's doing, what is all the stuff that's being created and why is it so valuable? And oh, by the way, it requires almost no capital investment by government, right? I mean, the data-driven stuff is there's some operational cost to it, but it's not that much. The spectrum, it's ours, so why not reallocate it in a way that supports public sector use and innovation in public service delivery. And I think that's really the argument that needs to be made. It's not any one particular application, but it's really the collective capacity that all these people have demonstrated to change the way cities work.
Right, so would it be policies around opening up data or making it more accessible, or that we need
Well, you know what I think will make it work is if you guys go out and create incredibly bandwidth-hungry applications and just decimate the cell phone networks. And, you know, I mean, I think the other place that it comes up is during disasters and crises, and we've seen time and time again that these networks just completely fail. And there are some fail-safes in place now. So after 9/11, they finally got serious about this thing called GETS, which is basically reserves cell phone capacity for government employees. And we all know that government employees, they use their mobiles. They don't use the other tools that they're given. And it just cracks me up when I see cops talking on cell phones. Because, you know, like the money that we've spent on wireless networks for police is just ridiculous, and they still prefer to use the cell phones. But it shows that that's the important infrastructure. So, yeah, I think it'll be some critical thing failing because there wasn't enough capacity, and it'll probably happen in an emergency, and then someone will think, hey, you know, maybe the consumer networks actually are public safety networks, and we need to think about them differently.
I saw a question right down here. Oh, we already have a mic over here and then over here.
A quick observation and then a question. The observation is that content distribution networks like Akamai and proxy caching allow thousands of people to see stock prices and sports scores with no delay. So it seems like as long as we're pushing data like bus and train schedules, maybe we don't need as much bandwidth as you think. Mm-hmm. It seems like what you're saying is with all these additional devices and one-on-one conversations, that's when the crunch is coming. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of threw the Internet of Things in there just because it's a huge potential future application. But the poster that it came from is actually a Cisco infographic. And you scroll down and they start showing some of the like really interesting case studies. And one of them is a farm in the Netherlands that's like networked all its cows with wireless sensors. And they're like, this is streaming 200 megabits of data a year. I mean, you could do that over a 300 baud modem. Like, that's not a lot of data. What's really, I think, going to kill them is the video, because you can't cache a two-way video call. It has to be prioritized at the highest level. And I don't know, you know, Steve Jobs is on that stage, and he's got a pretty good track record of putting his finger on amazing things.
I want to ask my question, but I'll talk to you separately.
Okay.
There are strategies for extracting features, so you don't actually send the video. You send something that allows a near copy of the video to be reconstructed, and it's much more bit efficient.
I'd love to hear about it.
But my question for you is, what can we learn of the experience from South Korea, Finland, Israel, and other countries which are urbanized and which have used intensive cell networking, you know, smartphones and so forth?
I think that there needs to be, you know, a lot of those countries, I interviewed the head of Korea IT policy who like basically helped them get ahead in early 2000. And he said, oh, we were lucky. You know, they had a major crisis, a financial crisis in 1997, and they needed something to unite everybody and give them hope. And the internet just happened to be there. So, you know, there's a lot of luck involved, but there's also a lot of leadership. And the next thing he asked me after he told me that story was, I'm writing a new regulation for what kind of internet service should be in new apartments. How far apart should I require the Ethernet jacks to be? And I was like, oh my God, like, it's amazing. It's kind of a very top-down approach, but, you know, he was basically saying, I need something that's going to be a standard, a foundation for the entire country to build upon. And I'm not willing to wait and let the market decide what that's going to be, because I want it standardized and I want to move on to the next challenge. So the idea of sort of setting, you know, like a minimum threshold, which I think in our country, the broadband is still defined as 200 kilobits per second or more, which is crazy. I mean, it's just crazy how slow that is. Our broadband map, we just did this big census of broadband and basically collected no useful information for identifying areas where we need to invest to close digital divide. And a lot of it was just, again, because the federal regulators are too timid. So I would say, you know, we're in a crisis. We can start to set some standards here that don't cost a lot of money, but that organize things in a common direction. So.
I saw a question down here.
was wondering if you could talk about the scarcity aspect of it as well, in addition to the regulatory issues you brought up, in the sense that there's opportunity to still squeeze more bandwidth out of the existing spectrum, but fundamentally there's still a finite resource there, which is different in a sense than what we see with the traditional kind of wired internet or wired networks, where we can keep pulling more cable to connect the same places together. I'm kind of curious what that means in terms of what we're seeing right now in terms of this bifurcation of the internet, where we have the wired version and the unwired version, and they're kind of growing apart. And I'm wondering if that's something that's going to be in the future, not now, but once we've overcome these regulatory barriers, it's still going to be an irreconcilable reality that we have to think about and plan for, or if that's just really
part of the reason for going through that, and I didn't go into as much depth as I could about the evolution of cell networks, is it's just an incredibly difficult engineering problem to build something that big that performs at the incredible level that it does. I mean, if you saw like how hard it is to engineer cell phone networks so that when a train goes into a tunnel and comes out of it, that your call doesn't drop, it's incredibly complicated. It's so complicated, but they've done it, and they've done it really well. Some countries better than others. But just because of physics, it's a harder nut to crack than the wired side is, where the infrastructure, you just change the box at the end of it every couple of years, and the wires get faster. So it's always going to be a generation behind. The wide area stuff is always going to be a generation behind stuff like Wi-Fi, which operates over a much smaller area. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. And the other thing is it takes a long time to roll these things out. It takes many years to roll them out. And so you'll always have urban areas getting service long before outlying areas do. And it's just kind of, whether that ever stabilizes is an open question. But I think for the next couple of decades at least, we're going to constantly be in this scarcity situation.
Yeah, I have another question, because I think we're coming at some of these issues that it seems like from top down, like what does the government need to do, or what kind of policies do we need to do? But then I'm kind of thinking, well, what are some of the bottom-up strategies, and specifically thinking like, how can like setting up wireless mesh networks kind of affect these holes or affect policy? If we begin to kind of develop new mesh networks, can we change the policies that's coming from top down? Kind of thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's two places right now that I'm looking very closely at: Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Kansas City. Chattanooga has a electric power authority, which is actually set up as part of the New Deal, and they fought hard against telcos and the state legislature, and they built a fiber network throughout the whole city. It's been running for 2 years. It has a Wi-Fi mesh network that's laid on top of it. In some ways, that's the killer app for it. And there are crazy things going on down there. They bought a bunch of little UAVs that are like, I don't know, like $50,000 a piece, and attach them to cameras. So city workers can like fly these UAVs like over construction sites, over accident sites, and do inspections that they couldn't do otherwise. And I saw that and I just went, wow. The other thing, similar projects is happening. So you got about 200,000 people who now have access to a gigabit per second broadband network. So that's why I say build bandwidth hungry applications, because the capacity will probably be there, at least on the wired side. And then in Kansas City, Google is pushing ahead a major fiber deployment there. They're talking about 500,000 homes. And what's so fascinating is it has completely galvanized the community to come together. And I watched 2 videos last week. One was an NSF workshop of computer scientists talking about gigabit networking applications. And they had a couple interesting ideas, nothing really interesting. And then I watched the video of this community stakeholder group in Kansas City that did the same thing. They were brainstorming gigabit applications. And it was absolutely fascinating, the things that they came up with. And I think that process is just going to be repeated and repeated, and groups like Code for America and Open Plans and others are going to be the ones that sort of cross-fertilize all the good ideas. So I think, it's, I keep thinking about, Clay Shirky wrote this essay a couple years ago called Situated Software, and he was talking about that idea that like, it's possible now for 2 people to write an app that 100 other people use and sustain it, and that's totally fine. So I think that's the kind of magic that's happening, and in a couple of years we won't be able to get all the people in this room that are interested in this topic.
Other questions? Yeah, one back here.
So if you were the ruler of the world, what is the most
awesome.
equitable way of assigning spectrum? And I come to this somewhat from sort of my origins. India had this amazing spectrum allocation, it was a $40 billion scam, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. But what is an equitable way that allows large investments to follow, but at the same time still makes the whole process very transparent?
There's two big kind of extreme positions that people argue for. One is the property rights approach. So basically, it's just a tradable resource, and you let the market sort out who's willing to pay for the spectrum. And then the other approach is a commons-based approach, which is all about creating technical standards to coordinate use of the frequency. It seems like the commons-based approach is winning out, largely because of the success of Wi-Fi in the marketplace. There's also some downsides to Wi-Fi, and it doesn't work over wide areas for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think treating it more as a commons, like the other resources like air and water and even land in some circumstances, is probably the better way to move towards. And the technology seems to sort of want to go that direction too.
Okay, it's been a long day. Do we have any other
closing comments?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So we'll just. Do you want to kind of come up and make some closing comments? Yeah. I think. Oh. Yeah. No. I just think this was a really exciting day. I think that some of the conversations that we had today are very different than what we've heard before, but I think we've heard a lot about how we can think about data technology in city. I think there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of thinking about opening up data. I think we've seen some really great examples of that, but within city agencies, thinking about what open data means. We've seen some really innovative government strategies for that, but not every government's thinking like that. So how can we make that kind of be more a standard throughout city agencies? Standards is another issue. Standards are super important to do all of the type of work that we were talking about today, and I think and that's something that we really need to discuss more clearly. How can we create standards that allow us to freely share data across different agencies? I think that's one of the biggest barriers. Like, you can have data in one agency, but can't read it by another. And so there are standards set up, and how do we inform different agencies about these standards is also a big deal.
And then just to make one final point, bringing it back to transportation planning, I think one of the things that we heard today is that a lot of the way that we've been planning our transportation systems has been proven wrong as we've been learning more and more about how people actually travel. And I think that with cell phones, with GPS technologies, there's a real opportunity to not just plan our transportation systems differently, but I think there's an opportunity that the pedestrian, the cyclist, any person as they're mobile, as they're moving, will be now counted into the system, rather than just asking people, how did you get to work primarily last week? So there's a real chance for new data to challenge the way we conventionally think about transportation planning, and I think that we'll all find both good and bad challenges within that. So with that, we'll wrap up the sessions. We do want to make sure that we pay special acknowledgement to the support that we've received. Rockefeller Foundation has supported this conference. The University Transportation Research Center has supported this conference. The Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation has supported this, as has the Spatial Information Design Lab. So we are very grateful for all of the support we have received. There is a reception from 5 to 7 that is going on, and as part of that reception, please check out the exhibit of Sarah Williams' work on checking in on using check-ins from Foursquare and MySpace that you've seen as you came down. If you want to say another word about that.
Yeah, no, I would. I guess one thing I wanted to kind of say is we have all these new forms of data, and how do we make sense of it? And I think we saw a couple applications of how we can make sense of it, but one thing I don't think we talked about is like a lot of that data is privately owned, and I kind of think one thing that we need to think about in the future is how can private data be used for a public good. So we talked a lot about public data being used for a public good and the challenges involved in that, and I kind of really think one thing that we start to need to think about is how private data can be used for public good. And so we saw examples of cell phone data, but those are rare instances where we can get access to it. There are no policies, regulations around how that data can be used. There's a lot of potentials for transportation, but there's also potential for emergency disaster events and other kinds of things. 80% of our data that we collect right now is privately owned. So this is a big issue, I think, as we move forward. We have challenges in making public data open, but how can we kind of encourage that? Is it something we should do in the market? But, and I kind of want to leave us thinking of that because I think that's kind of the next area that we want to really discuss and focus. I think we don't have policies around how cell phone data can be used for transportation planning. We've seen examples how it can help encourage transportation research, but we need to kind of incorporate that in a systematic way. So the exhibit is kind of trying to take some of that privately owned data from Foursquare and Facebook. We actually suck data out of both of these APIs to kind of see what it tells us about the city over 2 weeks to kind of begin to see how can we access private data sets to tell something new about the city. So I would really like to join all of you for a drink and see you at the reception. Thanks so much for joining us.